Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Michelle Ronksley-Pavia. Welcome to Show Me the Way, Pets for Caring and Coping in the Lives of Twice Exceptional Children. Now this presentation is presented as an on-demand virtual session for the World Conference for Gifted and Talented Children 2021. It's really great to be able to share with you some of my research in this area. So during this session, I'm going to talk about the background to the study in terms of conceptualizing the two parts of twice exceptionality, that is the exceptionality of giftedness and the exceptionality of one or more disabilities. A preliminary outline of the main study, so the finding that I'm talking about today around pets in the lives of twice exceptional children comes from a broader, wider study into the lived experiences of 8 twice exceptional children. So I'm going to focus on that theme, but I wanted to give you some background to the actual project, the whole project, before I focus in on one of the specific findings. Look at briefly some key literature, and then the preliminary findings and the summary and recommendations. So to date, there's little to no research in this area in terms of looking at animals or pets in particular in the lives of twice exceptional children. Now, we do know from previous research in the areas of students with disabilities, children with disabilities, that they can have some therapeutic and beneficial effects for children and for children more broadly, all children in fact. So through that wider study that I mentioned before about looking at the lived experiences of the 8 twice exceptional children, an incidental and quite unexpected finding emerged around the importance of pets in the lives of these 8 twice exceptional children when we went out and interviewed them. So pets emerged as a really important part of the children's lives, particularly around companionship, stress reduction, coping, and resilience. So the suggested findings, the findings that suggest increased social emotional well-being for these students and some increases around self-concept and self-esteem when they'd bonded with their pets and when they really made those pets part of their everyday lives. So conceptualizing giftedness in Australia, I know it's quite difficult across the world. We tend not to agree on an overall definition globally, but in Australia, there's general consensus across the educational jurisdiction states and territories of Australia that Gagne's model is the most widely accepted conceptualization or definition of giftedness across educational settings, so schools, early childhood centres and so forth. And if you're not familiar with Gagne's model, it's gifts or talents. So you can see on that left-hand side there, Gagne talks about aptitudes as being gifts in the top 10% of age peers in those 6 different areas. So intellectual, creative, social, perceptual, muscular, and motor control. And then going through a developmental process to reach competencies or talents on that right-hand side in the green section in those different fields, so academic, technical, science and technology, arts, people services, management and sales, business systems, sports, athletics and games. And then there's that really complex developmental process in the middle there pertaining to things like environmental, intrapersonal and the developmental process around activities, investment, progress over time, educational environments, the chance factors sitting behind all of that. So the number of different models of giftedness and talent are also sometimes embedded in schools in Australia, but this is the one that's foremost accepted in educational environments. So connecting giftedness to twice exceptionality, we talk about those 2 exceptionalities. So the second one being disabilities or multiple disabilities or comorbid disabilities. And in Australia, we don't have the same kinds of understandings around the connection between ability and disability that perhaps is evident in places like North America. So twice exceptionality is very much a developing field in Australia, and probably the most research and the most awareness amongst educators has been taking place in the last 5 years. But we do have some overarching legislation that sits to support students or people with disabilities. So we have the Disability Discrimination Act, which talks about disabilities as being hidden as well as visible, and talks about the different, very broad conceptualizations of disability in terms of physical, intellectual, psychiatric, sensory, neurological, and learning disabilities. So any or all of those. They pretty much say in the Disability Discrimination Act, the DDA, that any disability previously existing, that currently exists, or that may exist in the future, such as an illness or any of those other disabilities, should be accepted as a disability. So it's a very broad definition. Sitting underneath that umbrella legislation are the Disability Standards in Education 2005. So these are all about clarifying the kind of obligations that educational settings, including schools, need to do to support students with disabilities to engage in the learning on what they say is on the same basis as a student who doesn't have the disability, by making reasonable adjustments and accommodations to the learning environment and to the activities, and enabling students with disabilities to participate in that way on the same basis as students without disabilities. And then in particular states and territories, each educational jurisdiction has their own policy around inclusive education, supporting not only students with disabilities, but all students with diverse learning needs. So here in Queensland, that is the Queensland Department of Education's inclusion policy. And I've given you a little screenshot snippet of that down there on the right-hand side, to look at their conceptualizations around every student succeeding in their inclusive education model. And you can see there on the left-hand side of that image that's got gifted and talented students, and down the bottom on the right-hand side, you can also see students with disability. So well recognized that these students exist, that they are diverse students, but they don't actually mention twice exceptional students specifically in that policy model. And that's replicated across most state and territory policy documents. But although they recognise these as separate concepts or separate issues or separate diversities within students, they don't recognise necessarily the connection together. So just a bit of important background information about both giftedness and disability in Australia to then conceptualise the understanding of twice exceptionality in this country. So this model I developed a few years ago to try and convey to educators in particular when I go and do professional development sessions with them about what twice exceptionality is, what it might look like. So there on the left-hand side in the blue section, you can see the disabilities specifically drawn from the Disability Discrimination Act that we have here in Australia, and then with some examples of those. Of course, this is not being an exhaustive list, but it helps to give educators and other people some idea around the types of disabilities that students may have in the classroom. And then on the right-hand side, we can see the conceptualisation of giftedness that's from the generally accepted definition in Australia, being Gagne's model. So in those 6 different areas, and then some examples of those. And then where the two meet in the middle is twice exceptionality. Obviously, it looks nice and neat in this model, and we know in reality it's quite a nuanced and in some cases a messy concept, and especially when we drill down to look at individuals. And you can also recognise here that disability is quite predominantly drawn from the medicalised model of disability. So it very much is reliant on medical practitioners making that diagnosis, whereas giftedness, we take a more holistic view of giftedness in Australia, not just IQ, but what are the students doing outside school? What are their areas of interest? What are their areas of strengths? What are they doing creatively wise? What are they doing outside school in terms of achievement? So recognising that students who are gifted are not necessarily actualising their talent as yet. I think we still have some way to go on that in Australia. We're slowly getting there. So we're drawing both language from giftedness and disability when we're talking about twice exceptional students. And it's getting that recognition across to teachers who are engaging with these students on a daily basis, that it doesn't necessarily mean that the disability is obvious or that giftedness is obvious in our twice exceptional students. It's getting over that sort of speed bump or that hill of the paradoxical notion around disability on one end of the scale and giftedness on the other end, and trying to get educators to understand that these two can actually meet, even though it's a paradoxical concept. So really getting teachers to understand that, and getting parents to understand and recognise that in their own children as well. And where possible, getting the children themselves to begin to have that self-understanding and self-awareness around being twice exceptional. So the research project that we undertook was a qualitative project. It was using narrative-informed case studies approach with 8 twice exceptional children, ranging from 9 years to 16 years old. We used semi-structured interviews over a period of 3 to 4 months, depending on accessibility to each of the children. We interviewed them in their homes. Their parents were often in another room, so nearby, but not necessarily sitting next to their children. The children were engaged in activities while we were interviewing them, so they could bring a portfolio of artifacts, a box with things that they found interesting, things from their own lives that facilitated that interview process. So starting off with a conversation about areas of interest to the children. We also additionally interviewed the parents as well. So once we'd finished that 3 or 4 months of interviews with the individual children, spaced out over a few weeks, we then did a follow-up interview with the parents, chatting about some of the themes and concepts that had been brought up with their children in the interviews. One of the first things that we observed was the presence of pets at the interview site. So when we went to the homes of the children, we were often greeted by pets, sometimes not so nice greetings by some of the dogs who wanted to know who we were and were quite barky and confrontational, but once they realised we were friendly, they tended to settle down. But throughout the interviews, all but one of the children actually had a pet. So it was an interesting thing that we noticed right from the very beginning, although we didn't necessarily think it would be something that came out in the study. So it wasn't something we set out to look at. So the whole project aimed to look at the lived experiences of these 8 twice exceptional children. The reason we did it with the interviews in their homes was to get away from clinical settings, to move away from educational settings, to really hopefully drill down to look at what the lived experiences of these children were, both within school and outside school. What was it that they were doing? What was it that was interested in? They were interested in what were the driving forces behind their education, their social emotional well-being, and so forth. So basically what it meant to be twice exceptional for each of these children. So sitting behind that were our 3 main research questions. So what were the lived experiences of these twice exceptional children? What kind of contextual factors shaped their lived experiences? And what did they understand about themselves? So with the semi-structured interviews, we would start the session, our interview protocol would just start off with a general chat. So the children would bring in what new objects they've got in their portfolio of artifacts that week or that interview session. They would lead that beginning part of the session. And we framed it as a chat more than an interview, to try and get away from that sort of potentially confrontational nature of an interviewer going into the interviewee setting as the person with the power. So trying to put more of the onus onto the child to lead the discussions within the frame of the questions that we had in the interview focus in terms of our research questions and what it was that we wanted to find out. So our 8 participants, we had five males and the rest were females. I'm just looking at this slide here with the different ages. So we've got 9 to 16 years. And the participants picked their own pseudonyms for the study. So that's why you've got some strange names. They're like Turbo, Cat 51, Ashley, Boomstick, Harry, Annie, Buster, and Bob. Bob's female, but she was very particular that she wanted to be known as Bob. And of course, we went with what they chose. So varying in age, varying in where they went to school. So state school, private school, TAFE is technical and further education college in Australia, where students tend to go post-school, but also in years 10 to 12, so the final 3 years of school in Australia, students can engage with learning in TAFE colleges. They might leave the school to go to the TAFE college, but generally they have teachers that come in. So it's kind of like a final stage of study with some subjects taken at TAFE, depending on what the student wants to do post-school. So the participants' disability profiles, they all had multiple disabilities. So not just one area, but multiple areas. Interestingly enough, they all had anxiety. So it's hard to see what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of scenario, whether the anxiety preceded the disabilities or the disabilities preceded the anxiety, or whether it was this kind of really messy kind of connection between what was going on. But they all had some kind of anxiety diagnosis, from generalized anxiety disorder to specific phobias relating to agoraphobia and things like that. You can see there that 3 of the participants had central auditory processing disorder, 4 of them had autism spectrum disorder, a couple with dysgraphia and a couple with dyspraxia. 5 of them had ADHD, one had a sensory disability, and 4 had dyslexia. Apologies that white space has come on in this slide and it's covering up those first names. But same name, so Turbo first, that you can't see on that slide. And I think then we're looking at Ashley, and under Boomstick is Harry. And then we've got Buster just above Bob. So apologies about that. Something's happened with the transfer in the recording. Their gifted assessment profiles, some of the students had actually had multiple gifted assessments, but we went with the most current one. And being a few years ago, that was the WISC-4, Stanford Binet 4, and the WISC-3 with some of them, because it had been quite a long time ago. So Bob, you could see her IQ test, the WISC-4, had been when she was 7 years old, so just a few years earlier. Buster in the study was 13 years old, so he had his WISC at age 9. And you can see there the considerable differences between the full-scale IQ score and the GAI. In actuality, Buster had such discrepancies between the sub-test scores that he probably should never have been given a full-scale IQ test. But nevertheless, it was on there. Annie had 2. She'd had the WISC-4 in the same year as the Stanford Binet. So we put both of those scores in there. Her mother felt that the WISC-4 didn't actually reflect her high abilities, because it had been done when she felt that her daughter was under duress. She was very stressed. She hadn't eaten, she hadn't slept, and so she didn't feel that strongly reflected her daughter's ability. Harry had his when he was 10 years younger than when he was in the study. So again, that was the WISC-3. So there could be some differences there between the different versions of the tests. Boomstick had the whisk. Ashley had a Whipsy R when she was very young. So again, she was 16 years for this project that we did. And then there was the sailors, and then we looked at achievements and out of school activities, creativity, school results and so forth. So a bit more holistic in terms of looking at Ashley. And then Cat 51 had a GAI of 121, but a lot of spikes in his profile, which is quite interesting. Same with Turbo, so GAI of 129. So if you're looking at a cutoff of 130, some of these students sit under that, but then had spikes, as I mentioned, in their profiles that were most likely, I know that's argumentatively indicative, but there were definitely other things going on. So the themes across the narratives that came out of the project related to these 5 areas: so personal interests, negative experiences, support network, stress coping and resilience, and sense of self. And the one that we're going to be focusing in on today to talk about is under support networks, the pets. So the children's pets kind of also fits in stress coping and resilience, but we placed it under support networks because that was probably where it best fitted. So drawing then from those 5 themes or thematic plot lines, we were looking at an overarching narrative of stigma. So stigma relating to the experiences of these 8 participants, the stigma around invisible disabilities, prior experiences of how they've been treated, how that related to their coping and resilience responses, their threatening environments that they felt and the stigma that sat behind that, and then trying to undo how they were perceived, so trying to disconfirm the stigma, and then stigma around not only giftedness but also disabilities and being perceived with either or of those, in some cases not recognised for either, so not quite sure where they fitted in. So we've written a couple of papers that have been published around these different findings. So if you're interested, feel free to go do a quick search. So there was one on the overarching stigma narrative, and then there's a couple of others relating to some of the other themes that came out of this one, particularly was around negative experiences of bullying. So our focus for this session obviously is around pets, so pets for caring and coping. And as I mentioned before, this was a really unexpected finding. We didn't even anticipate that this would be a thing, that there would be a role that pets would play in the support networks of these young people. So looking at the literature around the positive influences of pets on children's development is quite extensive. Children in general, but quite a lot of literature and prior research about students with disabilities. A lot of that points to mainly 5 themes or 5 areas. So self-concept, self-esteem and self-confidence we've listed there under the green box. Increases in self-concept and self-esteem for children who've bonded with their pets that they've got and promoting self-confidence. Autonomy, empathy and responsibility. So talking about the development of a child's autonomy. So being responsible for looking after the pet, for exercising the pet, for engaging and playing with the pets. So teaching that empathy and responsibility, feeding them, caring for them and so on, grooming them. Quite specifically for children with disability, giving that sense of calmness. So there were quite a few studies around autism spectrum disorder, horse therapy, riding for people who are disabled, who have disabilities, companionship, support animals. So we know about dogs for the blind, dogs for the deaf, dogs to help with PTSD, dogs supporting our veterans and so on. Interactions that promoted positive emotions too. So, a child who perhaps was feeling quite withdrawn and depressed, once they engaged with the pet or the dog or whoever the companion animal was, their emotions changed. And then that connects with the final one, they're reducing stress and anxiety. But just before we go to that, we'll just have a quick look at children and play with pets. So particular focus again for students with disability, particularly those with ASD, was increasing social interaction with others. So if there was an animal present when they were meeting strangers or when they're in a new environment or even a school environment, so thinking of a therapeutic dog, for example, they were much more likely to be able to engage and interact. And then reducing stress, it's well recognised across research that engaging with animals, patting animals, stroking animals, cuddling animals, lowers blood pressure, lowers heart rate, reduces anxiety and stress, lowers muscle tension, enables and improves relaxation and improves mood as well. So there was a lot of information in the literature about those particular components, but nothing that we could find relating quite specifically to twice exceptionality. So the children's pets, they all had pets except Annie. And interestingly, after we finished the study, before we even communicated the findings to parents, Annie's mum went out and they got a dog. We hadn't said anything about the study, but she had thought that and talked to her daughter's psychologist, and they had come to the conclusion that it might be a good idea to get her a companion dog. So it was really interesting that that kind of was happening at the same time as we were analysing and looking at our findings. So Turbo had a dog, Cat 51, Boomstick had 2 dogs, actually had 2 cats, Harry had a dog, Buster had a dog and a cat, and Bob had a dog. Along with all of this, they all had a really strong connection to animals. So they had these pets at home, or in Annie's case, didn't have a pet at home, but they would be doing activities that would be involving animals of some kind. So, for example, Buster went horse riding at the weekends. Annie had friends that she would go and stay with who had pet dogs. Cat 51 also had some hens, some chickens they had an acreage property, and they would have birds that would come and they would feed and look after the birds as well. Boomstick also had some guinea pigs that they looked after who were other friends, but they would look after them when the friends went on holiday. So there was a strong connection for all of the children to animals, not just their pets. And then they had quite a bit of responsibility, apart from Annie, for taking care of the pets. So feeding, playing, walking, companionship, and all those kind of things as well. So probably quite a lot in common there with a lot of children, not just twice exceptional children. So quote here from Cat 51, I do quite a bit with Honey, his pet dog, playing. I like to rest with her. She helps with my meltdowns. He had ASD as well as highly gifted. She rests with me, she plays with me, she licks me, and I play with her. So great there to see some of those examples coming up. Trevor, Buster's dad, was talking about his love for animals, his love of his pets and dogs. He has an affinity with animals and his horses, where he goes horse riding, and a real passion for him. So some preliminary findings that came out of our study around that particular focus on pets, when we honed in on that, was quite interesting. So that potential pets to increase self-concept and self-esteem is really important for 2E children. So it could be a necessary support, particularly for them in terms of previous research and connections to previous research, identifying that generally poor concept and self-esteem for 2E children. So the companionship that they got from their pets was really important as well. So observations from the interviews were, while we were there, when the pets were always seemed to be present at the time we were having the interviews. So there was quite a calming effect from that, especially from the interviewers sharing their own stories about their own pets and breaking the ice at the beginning of the series of interviews, or at the beginning of every interview session, was really important. We did some observations as well when we were doing the interviews, and we watched interactions. The particular one was between Cat 51 and his dog Honey, about the empathy and him reading and understanding his dog's behavior. So quite often the interviewer would be in the middle of the interview and he would see that the dog was requesting to go outside or requesting a drink or other things. So there was like cueing behavior, CUEING behavior that he was being in tune with or being attuned to, which was quite interesting. And Turbo, Ashley, Harry, Bob, and Cat 51, Boomstick, and Buster always talked about the kind of things that their pets got up to, how they provided distractions for them, especially from their troubles. So that connection to resilience and coping in the face of adverse experiences like bullying. So the preliminary findings have some important implications for home and educational practices, so suggesting that there could be a real therapeutic effect to pets in the lives of twice exceptional children. And a quote here from Cat 51, I do quite a bit with Honey. I like to rest with her and she helps me with my meltdowns. I think we covered that one before. So 3 key sub-themes that came out in relation to pets. Pets as partners in support networks, facilitating interaction and coping and resilience, which was that connection we saw previously. So the broader study really emphasised the importance of the support networks for the children. And then we saw that unlikely source of pets in the lives of these children and how that became evident. So constant partners in the individual interviews as we were going into the homes of the children, and then facilitating interaction. So that sort of icebreaker, not just at the beginning of the sessions, but sometimes throughout the sessions. If the children wanted to take a break, they would often not leave the room, but play with the dog or the cat or whoever the animal was that was present. And then being able to place them at ease and feeling confident that they had something initially in common with the person that was interviewing them. So breaking down those barriers and, the adult-child kind of relationship. And then that sort of played out across the interviews as well. So increasing interaction and sharing of lived experiences was interesting and important too. And then the coping and resilience. So children talked about how their pets helped and supported them in coping with stress, in coping with anxiety. They had somebody to cuddle, somebody to pat. And really important at the end of the day, Cat 51's mum shared about how she would take the dog in the car with her to go and do school pickups. And that really helped calm her son at the end of the day. He would come from school and be quite stressed, quite emotional. And when she had the dog in the car, she felt that it prevented him or sort of alleviated the stress that he would have that would develop into this huge meltdown in the car on the way home. So quite an interesting finding there. Buster's talked about his cat. I can't sleep without cuddling my cat. I was never good at relaxing or falling asleep. Now my cat sleeps with me. She depends on me and I depend on her. So that reciprocal relationship there. So a summary of recommendations. So obviously to date in the field of twice exceptional research, there wasn't any previously known research relating to twice exceptional children and their pets or any kind of therapeutic effects that might have. There was that disability research and research more generally about children and childhood relating to children and pets, but nothing specifically about twice exceptionality. It was a very unexpected finding in relation to the importance of pets in the lives of twice exceptional children. And it really points to some potentially beneficial effects of pets in the lives of these children. And I think has implications for both home and school learning environments. So there's further research needed to focus on the potential benefits in the presence of animals in enhancing the lives and the lived experiences of twice exceptional children and supporting their social and emotional well-being as well. So thank you, everybody. Feel free to contact me if you'd like any further information about our study, or if you just want to get in touch and give us some feedback or have any questions, we're more than happy to respond to you. Thanks so much for listening to the presentation. And the final slide just has some links and references on there that you might also be interested in. So bye for now, and thanks again for watching. Enjoy the rest of the conference.